Right. All right. Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for giving up your Saturday to come and hear the other side of the vaccination debate. You are clearly part of the thinking population, so congratulations. I'd also like to say welcome to Australia, where university research can be excluded from public debate and ridiculed, and where parents and citizens have to, on their days off, fundraise to advocate for their health rights in government policies. This is where we are at today. And I need to point out that when academic research is suppressed, we get indoctrination. And currently the Australian government has started a $5 million education campaign in institutions, schools, right through the curriculum, in hospitals. But this is not an education campaign when the other side of a scientific debate is ignored. So today, our topic today is the censorship of the vaccination debate. And is this a protective health policy? Now, this is a huge topic, and I've only got 30 minutes to try and get this information across to you in a way which I hope will be beneficial to you in making decisions about your children's health. So I'm going to talk about some specific examples of how my research has been suppressed, and I'm also going to try and give you the key as to why there's been so much effort by the lobby groups in suppressing this research. What are they trying to hide? Now, for those of you that have followed my research, you will have noticed that in November last year, we had the Lord Mayor of Sydney, Clover Moore, coming out in the papers and claiming that I should not be presenting my university research in council forums because this is a risk to public health. My university research. In traditional times, university research was used as the basis of government policy. But this would seem like 1984, George Orwell. Now, apparently, university research is a risk to public health. And this has also happened in Melbourne. The Melbourne Council has also said I'm not to present my research on vaccination in council venues. And of course, here we have the brilliant Perth billboard, which asked a very simple question: what is in a vaccine? And the government and the AMA were very threatened with this question. The media blew up. Again, we had our health minister, Roger Cook, the WA health minister, claim that this was a risk to public health, and we must look at ways to legislate to prohibit the public from discussing what is in a vaccine. Now, all of you will know that your health depends upon knowing what's in a vaccine. So there is something very clearly wrong with what our politicians are saying. And our health is at risk. How can our vaccination policies be protective policies if we're not allowed to know and discuss what's in the vaccines? And this is the key. You do not need a science degree to work this out. And that's what I'm going to show you in this presentation. Now, with the lobby groups, we have industry lobby groups that have been allowed to misuse the university's complaint system, the university's logo, the University of Wollongong's logo, and their Twitter handle to provide false and misleading information about my research. And I'm going to explain to you why they've gone to such lengths to prevent you seeing the research in my PhD thesis. The PhD thesis proves that the politicians are lying in Parliament, and they are designing public health policy that is a danger to our health. And that's very simply because they are ignoring the genetics of the population. That is the critical question. If any parent was to look at what ingredients are in a vaccine, you would look at the person who asked you to put that cocktail of chemicals into your baby, and you would say, "Don't be stupid, you are insane." And that's why that question is so threatening to politicians. So please don't believe that you need a PhD to make decisions on this topic. The lobby groups are purposely trying to confuse you with the literature. Whenever we put something out, whenever I put something out in my newsletter, you'll often see it immediately refuted without evidence in the newspapers or on some social blog. And we are in dangerous times here in Australia because our doctors and our nurses have been gagged. Their professional boards have said they are not to discuss the risks of this medical procedure. And this is being dismissed as anti-vaccination. So I'm going to go through some of these issues in this presentation. And I want you to take your glasses off and look at this issue from a different perspective. It is not, whose interest is it to dismiss the risks of this medical procedure? It's in the corporate interest risks, industry's risk, Murdoch's interest, the corporate media. It's a self-regulated corporate media. It is their interest to tell you that this is an anti-vaccination debate. Parents are trying to talk about the risks of vaccines. So the public interest in this issue has been removed simply by claiming this is all about anti-vaccination. So as many of you have heard, this isn't a debate about pro or anti-vaccination. You must, if anybody speaks to you about anti-vaccination, you must say to them, no, we are talking here about the risks of a medical procedure. And if these are not addressed, then your health is at risk and the government can experiment on the population, particularly when they ignore the adverse events to these vaccines and the fact that epigenetics is real. You have genes, we are all individually different. And the chemicals in these vaccines are known to cause neurological damage and autoimmune diseases. That's not a secret. Right? That is well documented by the Institute of Medicine and all the package inserts and pharmaceutical companies. So I would like to go through this topic with you thinking of this issue as being the risks of a medical procedure, and it is in the public interest to ensure that all of these risks are addressed. Right, so that's the main point to think about. When governments design public health policy, you're only going to promote health in a public policy if you use the ethical principles that are necessary for health to be the main focus. And in a health policy, you need to ensure that there's autonomy, that doctors, nurses and health professionals have the autonomy to assess the medical literature for themselves and to speak on social media and to their patients in their patients' best interests and present those risks of the medical procedure. But this has been removed in the government's vaccination policies. The no jab, no pay and play policies have removed autonomy from doctors. You will know that there are doctors in Australia now under investigation for looking after your best interest. That's the Hippocratic oath of being a doctor. So these doctors with integrity are now under attack by APRA. The Medical Board of Australia has regulated that any health professional who presents anti-vaccination material on social media or to their patients and doesn't promote the government's vaccination program, which has expanded significantly over the years, whilst the diseases have not been a risk to the majority of people, right? They can now no longer look after your interest in this policy. So that has been removed, and the other fundamental principle of a policy that can promote health and not other vested interests is, of course, objective research. And you've all heard from Jamie and Elizabeth. They've described in detail the institutional bias that now exists in the system to ensure that pharmaceutical research is all that is used in government policies on vaccination. And when there's no independent research, then the negative effects of vaccines can be reduced and even ignored completely, as is the case today, as we have now, the public now no longer has a voice in government policy. The politicians have actually refused to see me to discuss the research that I have produced on this issue. So we are in serious problems. So, as I've said, professional regulation is the way in which they're controlling this situation so that the public doesn't discuss the chemicals in the vaccines and their effects on the genetics of everybody individually. And they do not have they do not know the exact number and types of adverse events that are happening from vaccines, and this makes it an experiment on the population. This is being allowed. And they're dismissing it by saying it's anti-vaccination. So as you've heard, doctors are paid to vaccinate, paid to increase the vaccination rate of children under 4 years of age. Don't you think they should be paid to improve the health of the population? Not paid to improve the vaccination rates, which are unproven to be improving the health of the population, as you will see later in this presentation. Now, when you get coercion in a public health policy, a government policy, that means that doctors are no longer looking after the patient's interests. They can't put your interests first, they're putting the state's interests first, the government's interests first. They're forced to, otherwise they lose their livelihood. And that is a serious situation. So as this situation exists, it means that the no jab, no pay policies and the no jab, no play policies are not protecting health in the population. The main focus isn't health because they're coercive policies. They've breached fundamental human rights. They are protecting industry interests in government policy. And that's why these pro-vaccine lobby groups, they ignore the escalating autism in the population. They're ignoring the chronic illness in the population. They will only discuss any disease that is supposedly preventable by vaccine. That's not health. The quality of the population depends on looking at addressing all the illnesses in the population. And this is where we need to start acting and getting a voice on this issue. Some consumers are also being coerced with financial payments to vaccinate, and their employment. They can't get employed if they don't use all the 16 vaccines that some institutions are requiring. Now, don't you think that if this policy was for a legitimate public health purpose, that every child and adult would have been required to have all 16 vaccines in their lifetime and should be required to now if it's a legitimate public health policy? But that's not the case. This is a discriminatory public health policy with vaccines that, you know, my generation, they didn't even exist and we haven't used, and many of the vaccines weren't even developed till 2013. They were recommended in 2013 and then immediately made mandatory for our children. You know, this is a scam, and it's clearly showing that the focus of this policy is not health. This policy is actually protecting vested interests, industry interests in this policy, because the precautionary principle has not been adopted. So the doctors are serving the state, and they no longer are serving the patient's best interests. So the Declaration of Geneva, the Hippocratic oath that they take when they become doctors, has now been breached. So how has this happened? Now, you've heard a little bit about the media so far. The media is shaping your beliefs on vaccines, their beliefs, because the media is a self-regulated, corporate-sponsored media. And it's not in their interest to talk about the negative effects of vaccines, hence they just get dismissed as anti-vaccination material. But there's more to it than that. The Australian Communications and Media Authority has been told by the lobby groups, the AMA, Australian Medical Association, and the skeptics, the Australian skeptics, Savin, etc., that to present the other side of the issue is false balance. Right? They're suggesting there's a consensus on the science. But you can't have a consensus on the science if it hasn't been debated by all stakeholders in the issue, such as the citizens on whom the vaccines are going to be enforced, all researchers, all doctors, scientists. There has to be a public debate before you can get a consensus on the science. And there is no consensus on the science, yet our Australian Communications and Media Authority has been convinced to say that it's false balance. If our side of the debate, that is the risks of vaccines, get reported, all right? And hence, we have journalists now who are allowed to sprout their opinions on vaccines, just dismiss us all with ridicule, derogatory terms, which I'll show you in a minute, some of the terms that have been used, and someone with qualifications who has taken 8 to 10 years to look at the literature, to see what controlled the infectious diseases. Not a single journalist in Australia has come to ask for the information on this topic from me. And my PhD was completed 3 years ago. So these are the lobby groups that are powerful. They're pro-vaccine lobby groups that are clearly not addressing health because they're ignoring the skyrocketing autism and chronic illness. And the important ones to know are the Australian Medical Association, which is a lobby group for doctors and industry. They work together. You've got the Australian Skeptics Inc., which is actually non-scientists, but they use scientists to promote their message. And in fact, they started up an offshoot in 2009-10 called the Stop the Australian Vaccination Network. And that was because Meryl Dorey was having some success in presenting the risks of vaccines and getting people to question what we're injecting into our body. And she was targeted significantly once that anonymous Facebook group was established, and they're an offshoot of the Australian Skeptics Incorporated. And of course, then we've also got the Friends of Science in Medicine. They're very powerful. So here is the directive on giving immunisations that's presented in the Australian Immunisation Handbook that has been designed by the National Health and Medical Research Council. Specifically, the offshoot group ATAGI, the Vaccine Advisory Board, has put these directives together. So how is it in Australia that the government has been allowed to ignore this directive? The handbook states that vaccination must be given voluntarily in the absence of undue pressure, coercion and manipulation. But that's not just in the Australian Immunisation Handbook. It is stated in all international covenants. It is the fundamental practice of medicine, the Declaration of Geneva, as I said, the Hippocratic Oath. We've breached it here in Australia. We now have parents fighting each other because they're given different information on this issue, and one wants to vaccinate and the other one doesn't. There are many anxious people in the population because their jobs are at risk if they dare to talk about the risks of vaccines that they've seen in their own children. They're losing their jobs. It is not a choice, and the government is lying here because they're suggesting that they're not forcing vaccinations on anyone. But in fact, if you threaten someone with their job, if you link the vaccines to welfare benefits, that's not a choice. People cannot live without their jobs and their livelihood. They cannot live without the welfare benefits. So again, the government has lied in this respect. We need to start challenging this, and we do need more than a handful of people to get up and protect our rights in this country. So when I went through the university, this is the quote from my supervisor, Emeritus Professor Brian Martin. He stated, "This is a clear and direct attack on academic freedom. I have studied issues of intellectual freedom for many years. Never have I heard of a campaign against a research student as relentless and abusive as the one against Judy. As I mentioned, they used the complaint procedures to make up allegations. And I was investigated many times simply because I got involved in the debate through my website and on the internet. I publicly debated my research, as you are meant to do. And also the university's code of conduct says you're meant to be able to debate without harassment, ridicule or vitriol. But they have done this with impunity. And I'm just going to give you some examples of some of the cases that happened to me, because it does affect academic integrity. And it affects the worth of a degree. The experiences I had at university have been an attempt to discredit my degree. And the people that have discredited it have not done any investigation into this topic. And they've been allowed to do it. Again, I want to make it quite clear to you that this is a political situation. The science is quite clear. You ask anybody about the field of epigenetics and predisposition to disease and the chemicals in vaccines such as aluminium, formaldehyde, mercury, which is still in the vaccines, again another lie. You know, polysorbate 80 that causes infertility, they are in the vaccines, right? So this is a political situation, and it's to do with the conflicts of interest that you have previously heard about already and that are described in detail in my thesis. Right. Not a conspiracy theory, as all the journalists, with their lack of knowledge, are trying to tell you. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but the institutional bias starts right at the top with the Gavi Alliance, which is your Bill and Melinda Gates. It's actually public-private partnerships, and it's a group which includes the Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies, and they are advising the World Health Organization on which vaccines that all countries should be recommending on their schedules. So despite the fact that all countries have different environmental conditions and different genetic populations, we're all being told we need to use the same vaccines. Even rotavirus, which is gastroenteritis and not a big problem for children in a developed country. So all these things are being ignored while we're asleep and trusting our doctors and the government. So again, the ATAGI group you've heard about, and we've got the pharmaceutical funding of all the research. There is no research on vaccines that is used in government policy. It is all biased, pharmaceutically funded research with researchers. You've got the TGA, 100% funded by industry. So all of these things, and particularly the university-industry partnerships, the universities are now in partnership with industry, and they're allowing industry lobby groups to use their complaint procedures. And that's what has happened to me. They're also preventing us from debating this, as Elizabeth said, on the Conversation website. Right? You know, we get ridiculed and abused, even though their conduct, their conduct statement by the Conversation actually suggests that they don't allow that type of conduct, but with the vaccination debate, they do. And the other big opportunity for the Australian skeptics to get their misinformation out to the public is through the Mamma Mia website. Rachel Dunlop, Ken McLeod, Peter Bowditch all often speak through the Mamma Mia website. So there is a big institutional bias here that's preventing the public from having a voice on this issue. Suppression of vaccine research. These are some of the strategies that are used. Firstly, astroturfing. Again, the Australian Skeptics is supposedly a consumer organisation, very powerful one. And as I said, they're not looking at health as a whole issue. They're just looking at anything to do with vaccines and then ridiculing and abusing when we speak up and calling it anti-vax material. They're posing as a consumer group when in fact they're pushing industry interests in the policies. You've got university policies, again, the academic industry model. I'll go into some specific examples in a minute, which goes right to the heart of academic integrity, the worth of my degree. Politicians, the donations and lobbying system is perfect for the pharmaceutical companies to control this situation, as you've heard previously. And awards in science and journalism. When the journalists abuse and ridicule and use derogatory terms to dismiss anti-vaxxers, these journalists, and even one that provided false and misleading information on my research in 2016 was given an award. Right? And Cathy O'Leary in WA also given an award in journalism for presenting these sorts of issues to the public. And also awards for scientists. That system also is being used because money plays a big part in the ability to get an award. And people are being sidelined from the profession if they pick up these issues. There's no funding in this, in looking at questioning vaccines. I went to do an independent project on vaccines and the government wouldn't fund it. As a parent, I was only out to see if vaccinating my children, which I did, was the right thing to do. And that's not what I found. So, suppression. Public health authorities and politicians are using abusive, false and derogatory comments to dismiss the debate. So I'll just go through a couple of specific examples. West Australian Health Minister Roger Cook, after our billboard was put up, spreading dangerous misinformation with an insidious billboard. It is deceitful, very damaging. No, I don't think that's deceitful. It's actually what we want, transparency. It's the opposite. And contrary to the public interest, the opposite of that statement is true. Paranoid conspiracy theories from the anti-vax movement. That's how they're influencing your behaviour on vaccines. And here's some more. The federal AMA president, Michael Gannon, said last year, anti-vaxxers have reached new levels of stupidity. I guess because I don't vaccinate now, I'm stupid. Let's just ridicule and call people names. And he refers to the quack theories about the risks of vaccines. And yet nobody will address the scientific arguments in my PhD thesis that the University of Wollongong is standing by. That information is being suppressed. And as I said, until it's addressed, the politicians are lying to the public. And of course, we had the WAAMA President Omar Khorshid. The billboard should be banned using legislation that states regulators can prohibit advertising of any public health risk or activity. This is a pretty serious situation if they start moving ahead with this. Victorian Health Minister Gillian Hennessy has said, vaccines don't have any side effects. And the US government has paid out $4 billion to vaccine-injured victims, and that's believed to be only 10% of what is thought to be the actual number of vaccine victims that exist. And we're talking serious autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis and other neurological damage, seizures, convulsions, etc. Now, Professor Fiona Stanley has also made a comment. She said anti-vaccination campaigners are evil. Apparently that's another way to dismiss the argument. She claims there isn't the fear that there was because of vaccination. Now, I'd like to just put that to rest because in her own words, she has made this statement. Infectious deaths fell before widespread vaccination was implemented. Completely contradicts the statement before. And in developed countries, infectious diseases were not considered a serious risk after 1950. And just to make it quite clear what did reduce these infectious diseases, it was political and economic decisions that changed the living conditions during the early 1900s, from 1900 to 1950. And it says at the beginning of the 20th century, infant mortality rates to infectious diseases were very high, but they declined rapidly as environmental and host characteristics changed due to improved social circumstances, education and income levels. At this time, there were very few vaccines in use. Diphtheria had been in use and smallpox, but those diseases did not decline any more rapidly than all the other infectious diseases, to the point where public health officials in Australia stated by 1950, as causes of infant mortality in Australia, all the infective diseases have been overcome. By 1950, the population in developed countries were not thinking of infectious diseases as a serious risk. And this is the issue. It wasn't that the infectious diseases didn't exist. but the risk of death from these diseases had declined. And at this time, people were getting mild or even, in most cases, asymptomatic cases of these infections, and that was giving long-term immunity. And that's where the term herd immunity was coined, from natural exposure to the diseases at a time when the risk had been removed. Now, it looks like my time's up, and so I won't be able to get into the cases that happened to me whilst I was at university, so I'll save that for another time. But I just would like to encourage you all to know that the key to the issue is knowing what is in the vaccine, the chemicals that are in the vaccine, and making your own decision as to whether you think they're health-promoting substances that you want in your newborn babies. And if they're not, we need people to visibly stand up and take a stand on this issue so we can protect our right to choose what we inject into our bodies. So thank you for coming today.